Section 2 of Musings of a Chinese Mystic, Selections from the Philosophy of Chuang Tzu by Lionel Giles. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Introduction, Part 2. The comparative neglect of Chuang Tzu among the literati of the Middle Kingdom is no doubt chiefly due to his cavalier treatment of Confucius, of which we have just had a sample. Most of the writers who mention him speak of his hostile attitude towards the head of the orthodox school. As a matter of fact, this hostility has been a little exaggerated. For one thing, Chuang Tzu's attitude is by no means consistent. The tone adopted towards Confucius passes through every variety of shade. In the first 7 chapters, which form the nucleus of Chuang Tzu's work, he is assigned a very prominent position, acting for the most part as a mouthpiece of the author's own views, which he is made to expound with an air of authority. In only one passage is he treated with disrespect, though in another it is implied that he was a prophet unsuited to his age. In chapter 6, we may even discern a rough attempt at reconciling the two extremes of mystic Taoism and matter-of-fact Confucianism. In chapter 6, we may even discern a rough attempt at reconciling the two extremes of mystic Taoism and matter-of-fact Confucianism. It seems that all may not aspire to the more intimate communion with Tao, though Tao is the environment of all. For Confucius here resigns himself to the will of heaven, which has ordained that he, like the bulk of mankind, shall travel within the ordinary rule of life, with its limited outlook, its prejudices, forms, and ceremonies. But he frankly recognizes the superior blessedness of the favored few who can transcend it. In some of the later chapters, the genuineness of which is not always unimpeachable, the master is more severely handled. Especially does he appear to disadvantage, as might naturally be expected, in his alleged interviews with Lao Tzu. But in other places again, he is represented as an earnest inquirer after truth, or even cited as an acknowledged authority. He quotes words which now stand in the Tao Te Ching, and generally behaves more like a disciple of Lao Tzu than the head of a rival system. In chapter 22, by a strange piece of inadvertence, he is actually made to disparage the Confucianists with their scholastic quibbles, but it is in the last of the genuine chapters, entitled Li Tzu, that the acme of inconsistency is reached. Here, Confucius is attacked as a man of outward show and specious words. He mistakes the branch for the root. If entrusted with the welfare of the state, it will only be by mistake that he will succeed. Yet this tirade is immediately followed by a characteristic harangue in the Taoist vein, delivered by no other than the much maligned sage himself. It is hard indeed to imagine the central figure of the Analects speaking in this strain. There is nothing more fatal than intentional virtue when the mind looks outwards. For by thus looking outwards, the power of introspection is destroyed. What is it to aim at virtue? Why, a man who aims at virtue practices what he approves and condemns what he does not practice. Misrepresentation is carried to such lengths that sayings are put into his mouth which are the exact opposite of what he really uttered. And it is unlikely that Chuang Tzu had much scruple in thus harnessing the great teacher to his own doctrines. He was doubtless fully alive to the advantage of borrowing and, as it were, absorbing the unparalleled prestige of so great a man. Besides which, the sheer audacity of the scheme must have attracted him, and he carried it out with what the Confucianists are justified in regarding as the utmost effrontery. Yet it would be too much to say that this curious form of homage was wholly insincere. There are signs that Chuang Tzu was impressed, almost in spite of himself, by the pure personal character of the man whose whole view of life he distrusted, but whose message was so deeply printed in the hearts of his countrymen. He could not escape the common influence. The very frequency with which he brings Confucius upon the stage, whether as prophet or target for abuse, tells of a certain involuntary fascination. The state of doubt in which we are left with regard to our author's real estimate of Confucius may serve to call attention to the peculiar ironical quality of his mind, which pleasantly tempers his dogmatism and, indeed, often saves him from a sharp descent into the ridiculous. It would almost seem as if, true to the Taoist precept, he were endeavoring to break through the restraining bonds of his individual self and to contemplate his own judgments from the outside. Needless to say, there is a fount of deep, almost fierce earnestness in the man as well. But he never loses a certain delicacy of touch which lends peculiar aptness to the sobriquet of butterfly bestowed on him in allusion to his famous dream. To these qualities must be added, in order to complete a faint sketch of this unique figure in Chinese literature, a recurrent strain of pervasive melancholy, a mournful brooding over the doubtful doom of humankind. Take, for instance, these few lines picturing the mental faculties in their inevitable decline. Then, as under autumn and winter's blight comes gradual decay, a passing away like the flow of water, never to return. Finally, the block, when all is choked up like an old drain, the failing mind which shall not see light again. Just as the form of Chuang Tzu's work hovers on the borderland of poetry and prose, so the content is poetic rather than strictly philosophic, by reason of the lightness and grace with which he skims over subjects bristling with difficulty. Lucidity and precision of thought are sometimes sacrificed to imagination and beauty of style. He seldom attempts passages of sustained reasoning, but prefers to rely on flashes of literary inspiration. He is said to have shone in his verbal conflicts with Lao Tzu, but the specimens of his dialect that have been preserved are, perhaps, more subtle than convincing. The episode of the minnows under the bridge only proves that in arguing with a sophist, he could himself descend into sophistry, naked and unabashed. A noteworthy feature of Chuang Tzu's method is the wealth of illustration which he lavishes upon his favorite topics. In 100 various ways he contrives to point the moral which is never far from his thoughts. Realizing as fully as Herbert Spencer after him the necessity of constant iteration in order to force alien conceptions on unwilling minds, he returns again and again to the cardinal points of his system, and skillfully arrays his arguments in an endless stream of episode and anecdote. These anecdotes are usually thrown into the form of dialogue, not the compact and closely reasoned dialogue of Plato, but detached conversations between real or imaginary persons, sometimes easy in tone, sometimes declamatory, and here and there rising to fine heights of rhetoric. It may be objected to this method that it hinders the proper development of thought by destroying its continuity, and is therefore more suited to a merely popular work than to that of a really original thinker. On the other side, it can only be urged that it lends dramatic coloring and relieves the tedium inseparable from a long philosophical treatise. The objection, on the whole, has much force, and yet it is equally true that the alternative method would have robbed Chuang Tzu's work of more than half its charm. Its immortality is, after all, due less to the matter, much to which, to modern notions, is somewhat crude, than to the exquisite form. And certainly, as a means of fixing a principle in the mind, a single anecdote told by Chuang Tzu is worth reams of dry disquisition. Though the difficulty of his text and the abstruseness of his theme have been a bar to very widespread popularity, Chuang Tzu has never lost favor with the select band of scholars. From time to time, when Taoism happened to be in fashion, he also enjoyed considerable vogue at court. His book, like the Tao Te Ching, formed the subject of lectures and examinations, and several emperors are said to have studied and written upon it. In 713 A.D., it was specially decreed that those members of the public service should be singled out for promotion who were able to understand Chuang Tzu. That he was always considered a hard nut to crack is sufficiently shown by the flood of commentaries and other works devoted to his elucidation. Nevertheless, we are told as usual of a marvelous boy, one of the infant prodigies in whom Chinese annals are so rich, who at 12 years of age understood the meaning of both Lao Tzu and Chuang Tzu. The philosopher's works in Kuo Xiang's standard edition were printed for the first time in the year 1005 A.D., and the reigning emperor presented each of his ministers with a copy. Until we come to Lin Xi-chung at the beginning of the present dynasty, native criticism cannot be said to have thrown any very dazzling light on our author. An early writer, who may possibly have seen him in the flesh, complains that he hides himself in the clouds and has no knowledge of men. Another pronounces him reckless, one who submitted to no law. From a third we learn that, in his desire to free himself from the trammels of objective existences, he lost himself in the quicksand of metaphysics. Sometimes he is damned with the faintest of praise. In his teachings, propriety plays no part, neither are they founded on eternal principles. Nevertheless, they wear the semblance of wisdom and have their good points. On the other hand, rabid Confucianists insisted that his book was expressly intended to cast a slur on their master in order to make people accept his own heterodox teaching, and consequently nothing would satisfy them but that his writings should be burnt and his disciples cut off. As to the rights and wrongs of his system, they were not even worth discussing. From kindred poetic souls he has obtained more generous recognition. The great Po Chui of the Tang dynasty, with whom he appears to have been a special favorite, was inspired by the perusal of his works to write 3 short poems, one of which contains the following stanzas. Peaceful Old Age. Chuang Tzu said, "Tao gives me this toil in manhood, this repose in old age, this rest in death. Swiftly and soon the golden sun goes down, the blue sky wells afar into the night. Tao is the changeful world's environment. Happy are they that in its laws delight. Tao gives me toil, youth's passion to achieve, and leisure in life's autumn and decay. I follow Tao, the seasons are my friends. Opposing it, misfortune comes my way. Within my breast no sorrows can abide. I feel the great world's spirit through me thrill, and as a cloud I drift before the wind, or with the random swallow take my will. As underneath the mulberry tree I dream, the water clock drips on, and dawn appears. A new day shines o'er wrinkles and white hair, the symbols of the fullness of my years. If I depart, I cast no look behind. If still alive, I still am free from care. Since life and death in cycles come and go, of little moment are the days to spare. Thus, strong in faith, I wait and long to be one with the pulsings of eternity." The Brahmanistic influence which these lines betray is faithfully reflected from Chuang Tzu. There are critics who would trace the same influence further back still, and regard the speculations of Lao Tzu himself as borrowed directly from India. But in the absence of any trustworthy evidence of communication between the two countries at that early date, the final verdict on this theory cannot yet be pronounced. With Chuang Tzu, the case is somewhat different. The intervening period had seen the rise of Gautama and the spreading of a new and powerful religion which embodied in itself all the more essential parts of the Brahmanistic creed. By Chuang Tzu's time, Buddhism had probably penetrated far and wide throughout Asia. It was not officially introduced into China until much later, but it seems only reasonable to suppose that driblets must have filtered through here and there. Certainly we find in the Chinese philosopher such striking points of similarity to Brahmanism as can hardly be explained as mere coincidences of thought. He believes, for instance, that every human being has a soul which is an emanation from the great impersonal soul of the universe. In contradistinction to the mind, which is only the scene or background of our ever-changing sensations and emotions, and dies with the body, the soul is in its nature immortal, and after passing through a series of different states in conditioned being, finally reunites with the divine essence whence it sprang. How to hasten the attainment of this goal of supreme bliss, that is the question which lies at the root of Chuang Tzu's philosophy. And his answer points to the abstract contemplation of Tao as the only means of destroying attachment to existence for its own sake, and thus loosening the soul from its bodily fetters. So far he resembles the Buddhist, but when he comes to touch on the contemplative life, we find him diverging from the recognized Buddhist ideal in one or two notable particulars. To him, the highest form of virtue does not mean the mortification of animal instincts. Rather would he like these to have free and natural scope. Nor does it consist of living the life of a hermit, for the perfect man can transcend the limits of the human and yet not withdraw from the world. Those, he says, who would benefit mankind from deep forests or lofty mountains are simply unequal to the strain upon their higher natures. Again, his hatred of outward show leads him to condemn anything approaching ritualism or asceticism, which he perceives truly enough to be symptoms of decay in the moral fiber. The only form of fasting he will recommend is the fasting of the heart. But divested thus of every shred of materialistic grossness and converted into a purely spiritual creed, Taoism soon became altogether too shadowy and impalpable to stand alone against its formidable rival. It had to await the infusion of much-needed Buddhist elements before it could reassert itself as a national religion. This decline it was Chuang Tzu's fate to hasten, rather than to arrest. His capital error lay in neglecting to develop those grand and simple moral truths with which Lao Tzu had leavened his abstruser speculations. The virtues of humility, gentleness, and forgiveness of injury, which the earlier Taoist gospel held in such high esteem, are by him either passed over in silence or subordinated to the all-engrossing mystic purpose. Thus it was that the glowing promise of a singularly exalted moral code died away in later hands to the dust and ashes of a spurious metaphysic. No doubt, as a thoroughgoing exponent of his own principles, Chuang Tzu cared but little for outward and visible results. He was in no sense a propagandist. The kingdom of the mind was his real province. Yet the fact remains that the intellectual elevation and refinement of his system placed it beyond the grasp of all except a few. Unlike Confucius, he made little or no provision for the struggling mass of mankind which could not be expected to rise to the higher planes of abstract thought. This, however, is a criticism which leaves Chuang Tzu's literary position unaffected, and it is literature, after all, which claims the immortal part of his name and fame. For he of all the ancients wielded the most perfect mastery over Chinese prose style, and was the first to show what heights of eloquence and beauty his native language could attain. And in these respects, great as the achievements are of which later Chinese literature can boast, he has never been surpassed. Indeed, his master hand sounded chords that have vibrated since to no other touch. Finally, what effect may his writings be expected to produce on the modern Western mind? It is certain that to many, even through the necessarily imperfect medium of a translation, he already makes a powerful appeal. And it may at least be safely predicted that a far greater number of readers will be attracted by his originality and grace than repelled by the rather fantastic vagaries of his mysticism. End of section 2.